Imagine standing before a 30-ton steel tank and realizing you can lift it with one hand, not because you're a hero, but because the entire war is a lie. The year is 1944. The fields of northern France are choked with the smell of diesel and the heavy humidity of a summer defined by iron. Through the narrow slit of a German reconnaissance lens, a terrifying sight emerges from the trio on a massive column of American Sherman tanks, 30 tons of steel apiece, rumbling toward the front. The German observer marks his map, his hands trembling as he prepares to call in the coordinates for a devastating artillery strike. But then, something impossible happens. Two American GIs walk up to one of these steel monsters, reach beneath its hull, and effortlessly lift the entire tank over their heads. This was not a miracle of superhuman strength, and it was not a hallucination born of battle fatigue. It was the birth of a masterpiece of deception. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit the world would eventually come to know as the Ghost Army. While the rest of the Allied forces carried rifles and grenades, these men carried paintbrushes, record players, and air pumps. They were a division of 1,100 souls who went to war with the intention of never firing a single bullet. Yet their presence would alter the course of the European theater forever. Their mission was simple in theory but terrifying in execution: to be wherever the real army was not. To understand the Ghost Army, you must first understand that they were not soldiers in the traditional sense. When the Pentagon began recruiting for this top-secret mission, they didn't look for the sharpshooters or the demolition experts. Instead, they scoured the hallways of the Pratt Institute, the Cooper Union, and the prestigious art schools of New York and Philadelphia. They recruited set designers from Hollywood, architects from Chicago, and sound engineers who had spent their lives perfecting the acoustics of radio dramas. These were men who saw the world through the lens of aesthetics and delusion. They were taught the basics of military life. Yes, but their true training involved the art of the big lie. They were the first tactical deception unit in the history of the United States Army, tasked with a singular, high-stakes goal to fool Adolf Hitler, has stopped generals into believing that the Allies were stronger, faster, and more numerous than they actually were. After the chaos of D-Day, the Allied advance faced a critical problem. The front lines were thin, and the German defense was desperate. To punch through, the Allies needed to create openings, and that meant tricking the enemy into moving their heavy divisions away from the real points of attack. This was the stage upon which the Ghost Army would perform. Their strategy was built upon a triad of deception, a three-headed hydra of misinformation that attacked the enemy's senses from every possible angle. The first pillar was visual deception. To the naked eye or the high-altitude cameras of German spy planes, the Ghost Army looked like a formidable armored division. In reality, it was a collection of high-grade rubber inflatables. These were not the bouncy castles of a modern fairground. They were meticulously crafted shells of Sherman Anks jeeps and transport trucks. From a few hundred yards away, the shadows and the painted textures were indistinguishable from cold, hard steel. But the illusion didn't stop at the object itself. These artists knew that a tank doesn't just sit in a field. It leaves a history. They used bulldozers to carve faked red marks into the mud, leading from the woods to their inflatable encampments. They hung laundry, built fake mess halls, and even created dummy airfields where the planes were nothing more than canvas and wood. They were creating a ghost landscape, a theater of war where the props were the only things that were real. But a visual lie is fragile. It can be shattered by a single brave scout. To bolster the illusion, they turned to the second pillar: sonic deception. Imagine a fleet of massive half-tracks, each equipped with 500-pound speakers and high-powered amplifiers. These were the mobile sound stages of the Ghost Army. They carried a library of wire recordings, the precursor to magnetic tape that contained the symphony of a moving army. They had recordings of tanks grinding their gears, the rhythmic clanking of bridges being built, and even the distant, muffled sound of soldiers swearing uncomplaining in the rain. These sounds could be projected up to 15 miles away, echoing through the French forests at night, to a German patrol shivering in a foxhole. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't just noise. It was the terrifying sound of 30,000 men and their machines moving toward them in the dark. The psychological impact was immense. The enemy wasn't just seeing ghosts. They were hearing them, and the fear those sounds instilled was as real as any bullet. The third and perhaps most sophisticated pillar was radio deception. In the 1940s, the airwaves were the nervous system of the military. The Germans had expert cryptographers and signal interceptors who spent every waking hour listening to the chatter of Allied radios. The Ghost Army gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. They created spoof radio networks, where operators would mimic the unique fist or typing style of real radio operators from famous divisions. They would transmit fake orders, discuss imaginary supply shortages, and mention fictional movements of troops. They were essentially writing a radio play in real time, broadcasted directly into the ears of the enemy high command. By weaving these three threads together, the rubber tanks, the recorded thunder, and the phantom radio signals, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops created an invisible shield of misinformation that protected the real soldiers who were miles away, preparing for the true strikes. The ultimate test of this artistry came in March 1945, during a mission known as Operation Viersen. The Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland. It was a massive undertaking, and the cost of failure would be catastrophic. The Ghost Army was given their most daring assignment, yet they had to impersonate to full divisions, roughly 30,000 men, to draw the German defenders away from the actual crossing point. For days, the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army worked tirelessly. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks and trucks. They blasted the sounds of heavy construction and armored movement across the river. But this time, the visual and sonic tricks were enough. They had to go method. The soldiers of the Ghost Army began wearing the shoulder patches of the divisions they were impersonating. They drove their few real trucks in endless loops, painting and repainting the bumper markings to make it look like a massive convoy was passing through. They frequented local taverns in nearby villages, pretending to be drunken, accidentally letting slip information about their supposed strength to the local spies they knew were watching. It was a masterpiece of countertangulation. They were living the light 24 hours a day, knowing that if the Germans realized they were facing a unit of artists instead of an army of tanks, they would be slaughtered in minutes. As the sun began to set over the Rhine, the tension was thick enough to touch. The German artillery began to pivot. Their scouts reported a massive buildup of American forces at the Viersen sector. The bait had been taken. The German High Command, convinced that the main Allied thrust was coming directly at the Ghost Army's position, shifted their reserve divisions and their heavy guns to meet the threat. They braced for an iron storm that would never come. Meanwhile, miles away, the real 9th Army crossed the Rhine with almost no resistance. The deception had worked perfectly. The artists had successfully held the attention of the German war machine, saving an estimated tens of thousands of lives by ensuring the real crossing was a surprise. They had turned the Rhine into a stage, and the German army into an unwitting audience for a play that ended in their own defeat. Yet, as the war drew to a close and the world celebrated the victory over tyranny, the men of the Ghost Army were met with a strange and difficult command. They were not allowed to tell their stories. There would be no victory parades for the men who carried rubber tanks. There would be no medals for the sound engineers who fooled the Wehrmacht. Their records were stamped with the highest level of classification, top secret. For 50 years, these veterans returned to their lives as painters, designers, and architects, carrying the weight of their silent heroism. They watched as history books were written, and their names were nowhere to be found. Their families knew they had served, but they never knew the true nature of the special work their fathers and grandfathers had done in the shadows of Europe. It wasn't until 1996, when the documents were finally declassified, that the world learned how a small group of creative minds had outmaneuvered the most feared military in the world. The legacy of the Ghost Army challenges our very understanding of power on the battlefield. It suggests that sometimes the most effective way to win a war is not through the destruction of the enemy, but through the mastery of their perception. How many more stories like this are still buried in the archives, waiting for the light of day to reveal the true architects of our history?